I'm going to kind of wing it because I left my little speech upstairs. We have Dr. Jeffrey Hansen here with us. He has worked in numerous areas in financial aid and education. He spent 14 years working with Access Group, which was actually one of our lenders when they used to lend private loans to graduate school level students. As kind of an educator, and he managed that department where he basically was doing outreach to schools and educating students and schools on borrowing and borrowing practices. He also worked as the director of financial aid at Northwestern University. So he has quite a bit of experience in this area. He's also he came with us, or he was here with us in the spring. He did some presentations in group settings like this, and also met with some of our graduating students. I know some of you already signed up to meet with him as well. He'll do a great job of giving you information on your individual case. But this is a great opportunity just to hear the different options that are available to you in regards to repayment. I know for some of you guys that's probably an anxiety, but hopefully he'll make it seem a little bit easier, a little more, or not so insurmountable. And without further ado, here's Jeffrey Hansen.
Thank you very much, Jamal. It's certainly my pleasure to be here, and what I want to do today is to really help you take charge of loan repayment. I can realize and appreciate that having debt associated with going to law school can create anxiety and stress, and now that you're in your final year of law school, and I'm assuming most of you are 3Ls. How many of you are 3L students? Are there any 2L students? Anyone else? All right. The 3Ls are the ones who are, recognizing that repayment is not that far off. The reality is it's actually a little over a year off. But the reality is when you graduate from law school, the repayment process and the steps leading to repayment will begin. And it can seem like a daunting process. And certainly looking at the amount you've had to borrow to get your degree can seem daunting, if not frightening and terrifying. And what I want to try to do in giving you this information today is to help sort of demystify the loan repayment process, to give you some concrete steps that I think can help you plan for repayment, and to reassure you that regardless of how much you've had to borrow to get your education, that you should be able to afford to repay that debt and still be able to achieve other things in your life financially. That the student loan debt should not prevent you from being able to accomplish other things financially. And that's because, at least with federal student loans, there's a lot of flexibility tied to loan repayment. And we're going to talk about that flexibility. Unfortunately, though, because of this flexibility, it makes the process seem more complicated. And that's also why I think it's important to have the chance to get several exposures to the information, but also why the law school has decided to give you also the opportunity to meet with me individually so that we can take this general information and apply it to your specific situation. Because I certainly don't want you sharing your personal financial situation with your classmates in this large setting. We also don't have the time to be able to do that for each of you. So that's why the one-on-one appointments are available. Now, there are still, I think, some appointments available this week, but if you don't have time to do it this week, I will be back in February or March to have additional one-on-one sessions. So just because you may not get the chance to do it this week, that doesn't mean you won't get the opportunity, if you want to see me individually, to do it in the spring, but you also can meet with Jamal in the financial aid office if you prefer. And having said that, let's go ahead and get started. Do all of you have copies of the handouts? I know someone just came in. Did you get the handouts? Okay. The largest handout is a copy of the slides that I'm going to be going through. And you may want to follow along. You don't need to. We are videotaping the presentation so that if you want to, for some reason, see it again, or if you have to leave before I finish, you certainly can take advantage of that. There are a couple of other handouts that I'll talk about as we go through the presentation. And I really think that you can take charge of loan repayment, and I think, in fact, it's really important that you do, because whether or not you plan for repayment or not, it's going to happen. These loans have to be repaid, and if you don't take charge, if you don't plan for it, it's still going to unfold and it's going to happen, but it'll likely be more difficult, more challenging for you, particularly if you've borrowed, on average, what the typical graduate from this law school borrows. So I think that hopefully with the strategies that I want to give you tonight, you can manage this debt successfully. So having said that, are you ready to get started? Okay, I need a lot more enthusiasm. I recognize it's late on a Monday, but it's still, nice weather, although I guess it is raining a little bit. And, you're almost done. So that's the good news. So let's try this again. Plus, there's free food back there. All right, let's try it again. You ready to get started? Yeah! Very good. All right, let's go. The first is the good news. And that is, there are federal payment plans, or with federal student loans, you have flexible repayment options that are designed to ensure that no matter what your financial circumstances are, you should be able to afford to repay these loans. And I really think that is good news, because I think it is reassuring to know that no matter how much you've had to borrow, there's going to be a payment plan that should fit your circumstances. And 2 years ago, I couldn't have necessarily said that. But with the introduction of the income-based repayment plan, or the IBR plan, I really feel that I can confidently say that to all of you. And we're going to talk a lot more about that plan along with the others as we go through the presentation. But I think in terms of developing an action plan, and by the way, there is actually a worksheet that I've developed that will be available on the school's website and that I give to you in the one-on-one sessions if you want to actually have an individual worksheet. But I think it involves 4 steps. The first step is to take stock of your loan portfolio. You need to understand what loans you have, how much you owe, and how much are these loans costing you, and particularly in terms of the interest rate. The second step is to determine when repayment will begin, because I'm sure that's something you're concerned about and you need to be prepared for. The third is to understand what repayment plans are available and how should you go about deciding which plan is going to best meet your needs, particularly if you can afford more than one of them. And finally, you need to prepare for contingencies. It's possible that you may not have a job when you first graduate. You may not get a job offer until after you know your bar exam results. That's not unusual. But the reality is your loans may come due before that occurs. And so what can you do if you can't afford to start making payments when payments come due? Or what if something happens once you're already in repayment that causes you to have temporary financial hardship? Then you need to at least get some temporary payment relief. There are options available to you, and we have to make sure you understand what those are. And you also need to understand what options you have if you want to refinance your loans through consolidation. Now, the information I'm going to be presenting to you now does not satisfy all the requirements for what's called exit counseling. And you will be required to go through exit counseling before you graduate. There will be information that I'm going to be giving you now that will be covered during that, in addition to some other things. What I'm really focusing on here are the things that I think you need to know and understand in order to successfully manage loan repayment. So let's start with step 1, taking stock of your student loan portfolio. What have you borrowed? Well, you've borrowed student loans, but you may have borrowed from several different sources. You may have borrowed FFEL, or direct loans, through the Federal Student Loan Program, and FFEL stands for the Federal Family Education Loan Program. Now, as it happens, here at the law school, you have been borrowing your loans through the Federal Direct Loan Program, where your lender was the U.S. Department of Education. But if you have loans from an undergraduate program or from a prior graduate program, it's possible that you borrowed your federal loans through a private bank, savings and loan, or financial institution like the one I used to work for, Access Group. And that would have been through the FFEL program. And regardless of whether it was an FFEL or a direct loan, basically you were borrowing from one of 3 different programs. The Stafford Loan Program, the Grad Plus Loan Program, and if you refinanced your loans, the Consolidation Loan Program. And it's really the Stafford Loan and the Grad Plus Loan that form the primary source of loan financing that you've been using here at the law school. Now, you also could have other federal loans, in particular a Perkins loan, that you might have received as an undergraduate or at another institution. And we're not really going to spend much time talking about the Perkins loan because most of you probably don't have much, if any, Perkins funding. But if you do, it's a fixed rate loan that has a fixed rate of 5%. You could have borrowed anywhere from $1,000 to a couple $1,000s a year. The lender was the school you were attending, and it will always be the school you attended. They may contract with a third party to service the loan, but nonetheless, it's a loan that you may have. And although what I'm going to be talking about relates primarily to the staffing of the Grad Plus loan, I will interject a few things about the Perkins. You may have borrowed private loans, supplemental loans, where the lender was a private financial institution and where these loans are not guaranteed or insured by the federal government. Hopefully you haven't borrowed any of those while here at the law school, except possibly a bar exam loan. They do not have the same degree of flexibility as federal loans, and they're not necessarily as desirable, but we will talk briefly about them. And finally, you may have borrowed an institutional loan, a loan that was funded directly by the school that you were attending. I don't believe that they have any of those type loans here for the law students, but you might have done so as an undergraduate. And we're going to be focusing on the loans you borrowed here in law school. And I first of all want to make sure you understand the difference between the FFEL program and the direct program. And the principal difference is who was the original lender. In the case of FFEL, it was a private financial institution. In the case of the direct program, it's the U.S. Department of Education. In the case of FFEL, it is possible that your lender sold the loan to somebody else, either another FFEL lender or the Department of Education. Again, this really applies to loans you would have received prior to coming to the law school, because for the time you've been here at USF, they've been participating in the direct loan program. And whether you used FFEL or direct was not a decision you made, it was a decision the school made for you. In both cases, the loans may be serviced by a third party, a company that the lender contracts with to manage all the transactions associated with the loan. And it is the servicer you're always going to be dealing with in terms of your loans. It's who you're getting all the correspondence from. They are representing the lender for you as in terms of managing those transactions. And direct loans are never sold. If your lender was the Department of Education, it should always be the Department of Education. The loans that are held by the department are serviced by one of 5 different companies currently, and they'll be adding additional servicers over the next couple of years. All of your loans with an individual lender should be serviced by the same servicer. That's certainly true in terms of direct loans, even though the direct loan program uses multiple servicers. And finally, only direct loans are eligible for public service loan forgiveness. And we're going to talk a little bit about that program. If you're planning a career either working for a 501c3 nonprofit or for a government agency, federal, state, local, or tribal, and you work full-time for at least 120 months, then any loans that you have outstanding in the direct loan program after you've made 120 months of qualifying payments, having worked full-time for a public service organization, either 501c3 or government, then any outstanding debt remaining at that point will be forgiven, and that's a tax-free benefit. And I have a number of slides at the end of the handout that we probably won't cover, but that address that. And in the spring, when I come back, I'll be doing a seminar specifically about the Public Service Loan Forgiveness Program and the options available for those of you who are planning a career in public service, either as a public interest attorney or working in the public sector. All right, who must you repay is obviously an important piece of information to know, and it's the current organization that holds the promissory note. It may be the original lender, that certainly is the case with the direct loan program, or it could be a different lender. It could be different from the original lender that you borrowed the funds from. You could have multiple loan holders, particularly if you had to borrow loans prior to coming to the law school. All of the federal loans you borrowed here at the law school, as I've already said, are direct loans. So in that case, it's the direct loan program. But if you have prior loans, then again, you may have FFEL loans that either are being serviced or held by that original lender or a different FFEL lender, or that were sold to the Department of Education. So of course it becomes important to know who has your loan now, because if you have any questions or if you're not sure who to contact, you need information about that. And that's where the National Student Loan Data System can be very helpful. This is a database that's been created by the U.S. Department of Education, and it has information about all of the federal loans you have ever borrowed, even if the loan has been subsequently being repaid, either directly outright or through consolidation. And you can access information on an SLDS with your Social Security number, the first 2 letters of your last name, your birth date, and the 4-digit PIN that you were assigned when you completed the FAFSA. And if you don't remember that PIN, you can get either a duplicate PIN or a new PIN by going to www.pin.ed.gov. And all of that is explained to you when you go out to NSLDS. And if you are going to have a one-on-one advising session with me, you do need to go out to NSLDS in advance and print out at least your initial loan summary screen so that we have information about your loans, because that's going to make the conversation a lot more useful to you. And NSLDS is a database that is getting information from all of the servicers of your federal loans. And they have to report information to that database at least once every 30 days. And they're reporting information about the current outstanding balance, the amount of interest that's accrued, when the loan was originated, when the loan is scheduled to enter repayment, whether the loan has a fixed or a variable interest rate, the current status of the loan, is it in grace, is it in repayment, is it in origination status, and it also gives you the name and contact information for the current holder of the loan and the current servicer of the loan. And that perhaps is the most important information that it provides, because if you've lost track of your loans, then this is one place you can go to find out who you need to contact in order to talk about your student loans. Any questions about this? All right. Another source of information about your credit, of course, would be your credit report. And all of your federal loans will eventually end up being reported to the National Credit Reporting Agencies. However, they don't necessarily get reported until the loans have actually entered repayment, because until that point, there's not a whole lot of information they have to report. But your credit report is a useful place to go if you've lost track of any private loans that you might have borrowed, because they also should be showing up on your credit report, and they'll at least have a contact phone number of whoever is currently holding and servicing that loan. But another reason for checking your credit report that really doesn't have anything to do with managing your student loans is the fact that as part of the process of getting admitted to the bar, you have to have demonstrated that you're of sound character and fitness. And one of the things that the state bar is going to require as a part of that process is that you're going to have to give them permission to pull your credit report, because they use how you have managed your credit in the past as one of the factors they evaluate as far as determining if you have good character and fitness and are really a good candidate for admission to the bar. And that's totally independent of whether or not you pass the bar exam or not. Now, it's a rare case where someone is not admitted to the bar because of their credit history, but it has happened. And so it's important that you check your credit report to make sure that all of the information on it is accurate. Because unfortunately, it has happened historically that incorrect information shows up on your credit report, information that actually belongs to someone else. And you want to make sure that the information on your credit report is only your information. And as a result of the FACT Act, the Fair and Accurate Credit Transactions Act of 2003, you have the right to get a free copy of your credit report once every 12 months from each of the 3 National Consumer Reporting Agencies, Equifax, Experian, and TransUnion. But there's only one place you can get it, and that's at annualcreditreport.com. That is the portal that the 3 consumer reporting agencies have created for you to get access to your free credit report. Now, I'm sure you may have seen those very interesting and entertaining commercials for freecreditreport.com, where they advertise that you can get a free credit report. Technically, what you're getting from them is a complimentary credit report after signing up for a fee-based service. Typically, it's a credit monitoring service. And so it's not really a free credit report. So if you want to get your free report as a result of the FACT Act, this is where you have to go. And I'd encourage all of you to get in the habit of doing that on a regular basis. Certainly, you want to check to make sure that all of the information is correct. Now, when it comes to how much you owe, this is going to depend upon a couple of things. First of all, it's going to depend upon how much did you borrow, the original principal amount. Secondly, it's going to depend upon whether or not the loan was subsidized or not. And a loan that's subsidized is a loan where the government or someone else is paying the interest on your behalf while you're in school during the period of time between when you're in school and when repayment begins, which is called the grace period, and during any periods of deferment. An unsubsidized loan has no subsidy, therefore interest starts accruing on the funds as soon as the funds are dispersed to you. You don't have to pay the interest during the in-school period, the grace period, or during deferment or forbearance. But if you don't, any interest that has accrued is going to be capitalized or added to the principal balance when the loan enters repayment and could be capitalized after any approved deferment or forbearance period. Another factor that will impact the cost or how much you owe is the interest rate, because obviously the higher the interest rate, the more interest has accrued. And finally, Another factor that will determine how much you end up paying back is how much interest that accrues gets capitalized when the loan's at a repayment. And there's actually a fifth factor that will determine how much you ultimately pay back, and that will be which payment plan you choose. Because there are 5 different payment plans available on federal loans, and they allow you anywhere from 10 to 25 years to pay back the loans. And obviously, if you pick a plan that takes longer to pay the loan back, you will pay more in total interest. So, let's look at an example that might give you a sense of how much you might owe. And this isn't going to be true for you as an individual, but it's representative of the class that graduated in the spring of 2011. That class, on average, borrowed $133,000 in change to get through the 3 years of law school here at USF. And that does not include any amount that was borrowed in an undergraduate or other graduate program, and it doesn't include any loans that were borrowed for post-enrollment expenses, like the bar exam. It also does not include other forms of debt that you may have, such as credit card debt or other personal loans. And so you had $133,000 on average by that class, and of that, about $107,000 was unsubsidized, so interest was accruing on the unsubsidized direct student loan and the unsubsidized Grad Plus loan. And I estimate that over the 3 years of law school and the 6 months following graduation, before repayment actually started, about $17,200 of interest accrued. Here I'm assuming the interest rate on the Stafford or the direct student loans was 6.8%, which is the rate on your fixed direct student loans, and 7.9% fixed on the Grad Plus, which is the rate that you are being charged on your direct Grad Plus loans. So that the amount of debt when repayment began 6 months after graduation was just a little bit over $150,000. Now, I'm going to estimate that the average amount borrowed by this class will be a little bit higher because tuition has gone up every year and the cost of living has gone up, so it wouldn't surprise me if the average for your class will be a bit higher. But, you know, what matters to you is how much you borrow and how much you owe. But, although this number is a big number and can be frightening, I would encourage you not to focus on it. What should you focus on?
I know the answer. Your per month payment.
That's right, how much you have to pay per
I put
month.
attention to that.
I've already met with her
It
today.
was very helpful.
Yes, the reality is, what you have to manage is not that total. You have to manage what you have to pay month to month. And, you know, sometimes ask your parents, if they have bought a home and had a mortgage, ask them, how much did you obsess or focus on the total mortgage? And they're probably going to say, well, we thought about it, but what we really worried about and thought about was that monthly mortgage payment. And you really want to think of your student loan debt as like a mortgage. Because just as a mortgage on a home is an investment in housing, your student loans were an investment in your education. I'm assuming you borrowed this money because you had to, not because you found the financial aid process to be fun. It's not a fun process. Jamal and you know, the staff of the financial aid office do the best job that they can, but it's a very bureaucratic process, in part because, remember, that amount was borrowed given that these individuals did not have any income. You know, that's a pretty risky process and risky proposition. You have borrowed whatever you've borrowed without having to prove that you were going to have the ability to pay it back. Because if we required you to do that, you wouldn't have been able to get the loans in the first place. Now, hopefully you borrowed the minimum amount you needed to get through law school. My guess is you didn't. My guess is you ended up with more debt than you probably would have needed to, but so what? You know, you've got the debt, so you've got to deal with it, all right? Now, I'm going to be giving lectures to the first-year students tomorrow and on Wednesday, where I'm going to encourage them to try to borrow less. But, you know, it wouldn't do me any good to give you that talk, because it's too late. Although you still have 1 semester to go, chances are you're going to need the money that you have. So now let's talk about when repayment begins. We've talked about how much you might owe, what the debt is, and what it's costing. So we've addressed step 1 of the action plan. Now let's talk about step 2, and that's when does loan repayment begin? And it all depends upon several factors. One of them is what type of loan is it? If it's a Stafford, Direct, or Perkins loan, then you have a grace period, a period of time between when you graduate before repayment begins. And on the Direct and Stafford loans, that's 6 months. On the Perkins loan, it's 9 months. Then repayment will begin, and you'll either start making payments or you'll have to request to continue to postpone repayment. In either case, once the grace period is over, you have to take action. You either have to pick a payment plan, or you have to request to continue to postpone repayment. Now, of course, what happens if you don't pick a payment plan? Does that mean repayment will be delayed in some way? No, you'll just be put automatically on the standard payment plan, which is the payment plan that results in the least amount of interest being charged over the life of repayment, but it also results in the highest initial monthly payment. And for an individual with the typical amount of debt graduating from this law school, most of you probably aren't going to be able to afford that amount, at least starting out. Now, Grad Plus loan and consolidation loans don't have a grace period. They technically enter repayment as soon as the funds are dispersed to you. But if you're in school at least half-time, which would certainly be the case in the Grad Plus loan, then you're eligible for the in-school deferment, which the servicer was able to put in place automatically. You didn't even have to ask for it. You would have been notified in writing that it happened, and hopefully you noticed that, because anytime a loan is either put into deferment or taken out of a deferment, you have to receive written notice that that's occurred. You also have to be notified that a deferment's about ready to end, because you have to be prepared for repayment to begin, or to know that you need to request another deferment or a forbearance. Now, since no grace period exists, the loans are going to technically enter repayment as soon as the deferment ends, because the deferment is just temporarily postponing repayment. So you'll have to either pick a payment plan if you haven't already and start making payments, or you'll have to postpone repayment. Now, the good news is that there is also an added little difference when it comes to certain Grad Plus loans. For Grad Plus loans that were first dispersed on or after July 1st of 2008, which applies probably to all of the Grad Plus loans you have, those particular Grad Plus loans have an automatic 6-month post-enrollment deferment. And notice that it's automatic. You don't have to ask for it. In fact, according to the regulations, you would have to opt out of this deferment, not opt in for it. And it should be automatic, but I would caution you to just sort of be paying attention to the information coming from the servicer, because that deferment cannot be put into place until the in-school deferment has ended. And technically, since the in-school deferment is ending and your loans are going back into active repayment, even if only for 30 seconds, the lender may send you repayment notices and disclosures. So just be watching for that notice that you've then gotten that automatic 6-month deferment. Because if you get a billing statement for your Grad Plus loans, then you certainly would want to contact the servicer and find out, why didn't you get this deferment? And it may have just been an oversight on their part. Any questions about this? I mean, this helps to sort of highlight the complexity of these programs. All right. What happens if you can't afford to start making payments when payments are due? Well, if for any reason you're experiencing financial hardship and you can't afford to start making payments when they're due, or once you're already in repayment, things change and you have to temporarily postpone repayment, you can do so through either deferment or forbearance, if you're eligible. And you'll at least be eligible for forbearance. But you also could consider repaying your loans through income-based repayment. Because if you take a look at the chart that was also handed out to you, if your income was zero, then your monthly payment in IDR would be zero. And that would give you the same payment relief you could get with a deferment or a forbearance. But one of the benefits of IDR is that if you're not paying all the interest that's accruing on the subsidized loans when in IDR, then the government is going to pay that portion of the interest that you're not paying for up to the first 3 years. So you have the potential to get some subsidy that you would not get with forbearance. Now, in terms of postponing repayment through deferment or forbearance, in both cases, you're temporarily postponing repayment because of the fact that you have something going on in your life that qualifies you for that situation. Deferment is always better than forbearance because in the case of deferment, if the loan was subsidized while you're in school, it will be subsidized during the deferment period. In other words, the government will be paying the interest on that loan or on that debt for you. Unfortunately, though, most law students, once they graduate, don't qualify for any of the currently available deferments. The current deferments that are available, there are 6 of them, are one, in the case that you're enrolled at least half-time as a student. Well, chances are you're done with school, so that doesn't apply. Another is in the case you're doing a graduate fellowship. Most law students, once they graduate, don't do that. A third would be the case that you're in a rehabilitation program for some medical condition that you're suffering from. And we certainly hope that isn't the case. The fourth would be if you are in active duty in the military and called into an area of hostility. That may be the case if you're in the military, but if not, that doesn't apply. The fifth and sixth have to do with if you're unemployed or if you're experiencing economic hardship. Now, those two sound like they might work. But unfortunately, there's some additional criteria associated with both of them that you probably wouldn't satisfy. In the case of the unemployment deferment, it's not just that you're unemployed. You also have to be actively seeking a job of any type, not just the job of an attorney. And you have to be registered with an employment agency. But career services at the law school does not qualify as an employment agency. And you're not typically going to get a job as an attorney anywhere by looking or registering with an employment agency. So as it happens in most cases, at least according to regulation, you would not qualify for the unemployment deferment, even if you were unemployed. Now, what about the economic hardship deferment? You might say, well, I may be unemployed and therefore experiencing economic hardship. Why wouldn't that work? Well, again, there's some additional criteria. In order to qualify for the economic hardship deferment, you either have to be receiving some form of public assistance benefits, like food stamps, which likely wouldn't be the case, or you have to be working full-time, but earning less than 150% of the federal poverty guideline for your household size. Well, 150% of the federal poverty guideline for a household size of 1 in 2011 is $16,335. And my guess is if you are working full-time, you will be earning more than that. Therefore, although you may feel you're experiencing economic hardship, you don't meet the criteria for it according to the government. Now, if you don't qualify for deferment, you will qualify for forbearance because the criteria are much less stringent. Basically, all you have to do is ask for it, and at least you'll get 6 to 12 months. Then you may, after that, to renew it, have to demonstrate financial hardship. But again, the hardship criteria are much less stringent than they are for the economic hardship deferment. And the primary reason for that is, unlike the deferment, forbearance doesn't come with any subsidy. So it's not costing the taxpayer anything, or it's not costing them as much to allow you to postpone repayment as it does if you got a deferment. So that's really the principal reason for the difference. But you know what I recommend that you do is, rather than contacting your loan servicer and saying, I want a deferment or forbearance, is to contact the servicer, because you'll have to contact them. They're not going to know that you can't afford to make the payment. And if you miss the payment, they are going to report that to the credit bureau, and immediately you'll start to have a negative impact on your credit score and your credit history. But what I would recommend that you do is that you contact the loan servicer and simply explain to them why you can't afford to make the payment. Then they will walk through with you what options they think apply, and you can pick the one that best meets your needs. Because between now and when that happens, it could be that Congress is going to change the rules, and that may be to your benefit. And I can't anticipate all the possible changes that could occur. The servicer will know what you're entitled to, but they should at least talk about deferment and forbearance, and they should also talk about income-based repayment as an alternative option. There you're not technically postponing repayment, you're in active repayment, but you may be paying a lot less and potentially nothing, which could give you the relief you need. Does that make sense? Do you have any questions about this? Now, in the back of the handout, in the section where I've given you some additional slides that we're actually not going to talk about, there are some additional slides that talk about deferment and forbearance if you want more information. Also know that it will be covered fully during the exit counseling that you have to go through, and I'm going to give you some website references near the end of the presentation where you can get more information as well. The bottom line is, if you can't afford to make payments, what should you do? You should contact the servicer of the loan as soon as you know you're not going to be able to make a payment by its due date. Then start having a discussion with them, because that's the first step you have to take. All right, step 3 in planning for repayment. Go ahead.
Okay. So I just wanted to just add on that. For students who do have undergrad debt that went into repayment before you actually came into law school, those options are going to be really important for you right after graduation. Your loans are going to go immediately into repayment. And I know most of you are going to be studying for the bar. So you want to definitely keep or identify those loans and make sure that they're either forbeared during that time or deferred.
That's a very good point, and it's something that I should have mentioned when we talked about when the loans go into repayment. If you do have loans that have already used up their grace period, at least direct student loans and Stafford loans, they don't get another grace period. And so as Jamal pointed out, they're currently in in-school deferment, and when you graduate, that deferment will end. Similarly, if you consolidated any of your prior student loans, which you could have done once they were in grace or in repayment, that consolidation loan also doesn't have a grace period. It's currently in an in-school deferment, but it's going to go back into active repayment as soon as you graduate. And if you can't afford to start making payments on those loans as soon as you graduate, then that's where deferment and forbearance become options, just as we've talked about. And again, the same applies, though chances are deferment won't really be an option, but forbearance likely would be. But you also could consider putting them in income-based repayment, although you probably want to wait to do that until the other loans enter repayment, so you sort of put everything into repayment at the same time. One additional point I'll make about Perkins, though, is that if you have used up the initial grace period of 9 months on the Perkins loan, but then subsequently got a deferment on your Perkins loan, in the Perkins program, there is a post-deferment grace period of 6 months. So you may get an additional 6 months grace period on a Perkins loan that you took out prior to coming to the law school, and you'll want to check with the servicer of that loan just to verify that. All right, you had a question.
Do deferments or forbearances impact your credit score?
Question is, do deferments or forbearances impact your credit score? And by this, I'm assuming you mean impact it in a negative way, and the answer is no. Because if you qualify for a deferment or forbearance, you are still in good standing on that loan. You have gotten permission to temporarily not make payments. So it does not, in and of itself, negatively affect your credit. It will likely be reported to the Consumer Reporting Agency. The status of the loan is deferred, but that's not viewed as a derogatory. Any other questions or comments? All right, let's talk about picking your payment plan. And I think there are several steps that need to be taking place in order for you to pick the plan. The first, obviously, is that you need to understand what the options are. The second is to think about your financial goals and to define what it is you're trying to accomplish, because that may inform your decision. For example, maybe your goal is to get this debt paid off as fast as you can, because you're concerned that every time you get the monthly billing statement, it's going to remind you of how much fun you had in law school. And you just don't want to have to deal with that level of excitement every month. You know, it's going to be too much for you. All right? So in that case, that would influence which plan you might choose, because you might want to pick the plan that's going to get the debt paid off most quickly that you can afford. Alternatively, it may be that your goal is to maximize your net worth by the time you're ready to retire. In which case, it actually might be better for you to pick a plan where you might not have to pay as much per month on your student loans, so that frees up some cash that you could use to start investing for retirement. It really deals with the notion in economics that we call opportunity cost. You know, if you have a certain amount of money available after you've paid your living expenses to pay back your student loans, and if that amount exceeds the minimum amount you would be required to pay, then that additional amount, you really have a choice as to how you spend it. And you have to decide which is going to be the best choice. Now, if your choice is to just buy a more expensive car, or to have a fancier apartment, or to buy more expensive clothes, that's not really leading to a long-term financial return that's beneficial. But on the other hand, if you decided that you'd like to start investing in retirement sooner, particularly if your employer was offering a match, that if you didn't contribute to retirement, then you're foregoing that match, which is in essence just giving up free money, then that might be important. Alternatively, maybe you want to try to buy a home or a condo or something, in which case you're going to have a down payment, and by having some cash that you could start saving towards that down payment, even though it meant you were going to take longer to pay off your student loans, maybe that would be beneficial. And that's really why I think you want to think about your financial goals. And although I won't talk more about it here, there are some additional slides in the back that sort of help you to think through that. Then obviously another factor is going to be to determine how much you can afford to pay based upon your living expenses and your income and so forth, because it may very well be the case that you can't afford all of the options. And my guess is that at least for some of you, that will in fact be true. Then you also want to think about the other debt that you have. If you're like most law students, you may have credit card debt, which is likely more costly to you than your student loans. And by cost, we're talking about the interest rate. most interest rates on credit cards are higher than the fixed rates you're paying on your federal student loans of 6.8% and 7.9%. And so if you could pay less on your student loans per month so you could get your other debt paid off more quickly, that would be a benefit to you financially. So again, you want to think about these things, and once you've looked at all of those things, then I think you're in a position to pick the plan that works best, if in fact you can afford more than one option. So let's talk about understanding your options first. There are 5 different payment plans, as I mentioned. They're Stafford, Direct, Grad Plus, and Consolidation loans. They're listed here: the standard plan, the graduation plan, the extended plan, and then there's income-sensitive repayment if you have an FFDL loan that you borrowed from a private bank or other financial institution prior to coming to law school. There's income contingent in the case of the direct, and then there's income-based. And what I'd encourage you to do in your handout is to circle or asterisk the standard, the extended, and the income-based. Because as it happens, you're probably going to be picking between one of those 3 rather than between all 5. And when we get to the example, it'll help, it'll really illustrate why I think that's true. And so that's why I've sort of darkened out the graduated and the income-sensitive, income-contingent plans. And I'm really not going to spend much time talking about those. But they are available too. And if you looked at the promissory note for your loans, or if you looked out on studentloans.gov, which is the website from the Department of Education that talks about all the repayment options on federal student loans, you could read a lot about the different payment plans. But when it comes right down to it, they differ in 2 significant ways: the structure of the payment and the length of time you have to pay the loan back in that plan. So that's what I'm really highlighting here. If you want a payment plan where you know that the payment is going to be the same amount every month during the life of repayment, then you want to pick a plan that has a fixed payment structure, because there the payment will not change. And there's only 2 options that offer that: the standard and the extended. With all of the other plans, your payment will change over time, either in a structured way, if it's a graduated plan, or as your income changes, if it's one of the income-based or related plans. So if that's important to you, that you have knowledge up front that you know the payment's not going to change, then you want to focus on one of those options that offers a fixed plan, provided you can afford it. The other is how long you have to repay, because obviously the longer it takes to repay the loan, the lower the monthly payment, but the more you're going to pay in interest over the life of repayment. Any questions about that? Now, the other way in which I think it's useful to look at these is to look at an actual example, which I'm going to do after I talk more fully about IBR. Because in having met students here last spring and this fall, and knowing the level of debt that most students have, and what their career trajectories are of students from this law school, my guess is that for many of you, IBR is in fact going to be the only payment plan that you can afford. So it's important to me that you understand it, because it is a bit more complicated than the other plans. So let's talk about that, but first, I forgot this slide is here, sorry. Let me just show you the difference between the standard and the extended plan in terms of monthly payments. And in general, the extended plan ends up with a monthly payment that's anywhere from 35 to 40% lower than it would be under the standard 10-year plan. And so depending upon what the interest rate is, this gives you an illustration of what the monthly payment would be for that level of debt. And so if you take your Stafford loan debt, which is at 6.8%, which is going to be somewhere between $50,000 and $75,000 in terms of law school, then you'll come to the payment on that part of the debt. It's either going to be somewhere between $575 and $863, or $604 and $906. Excuse me, or $347 and $521. Okay, so you're comparing these two. Now, in terms of the Grad Plus, which is at 7.9%, you're talking about these 2 columns. Now, you'll notice that I say that you're not eligible for extended repayment if your debt is $10,000 or $25,000. That's because in order to qualify for the extended repayment plan, you have to have more than $30,000 of direct loan debt, and you have to have first borrowed a direct loan on or after October 7th of 1998. Chances are you meet both of those requirements, so you will qualify for extended repayment. On your FFDL loans, the same rules have to apply. Now, So this gives you a general sense, comparatively, of what the monthly payments might look like. So if we look at that $150,000 of debt, here's what you're looking at. Your monthly payment's somewhere between here or here. Well, you know, again, I don't know if you're going to be able to afford that or not. But in general, what I can tell you is that if the amount of your total student loan debt exceeds your salary, your annual salary, then you're not likely going to be able to afford the standard plan. Okay? So just bear that in mind. And what is the probability that you're going to have a starting salary greater than $150,000? Well, I don't know. That's up to you. But I do know statistically that on average, less than 20% of the graduates from this law school start out working in large law firms, which is where you're most likely to be earning that kind of money. Okay? So again, you need to be honest with yourself, but that's kind of to give you a sense. Now, I'm sorry if this turned out that way. What happens if you can't afford standard or extended repayment? That's where income-based repayment comes into play. And I think in terms of understanding IBR, there's some questions you need to have answers to. First of all, who could benefit from IBR? Second, what loans are eligible? Third, how do you qualify? Fourth, how is the monthly payment calculated if you qualify? And finally, is there anything else you need to know? Well, first of all, who can benefit? Well, I think anyone can benefit, actually, from IBR, particularly if they need a monthly payment that's more affordable, or, and that's likely going to be the case, if the level of your student loan debt is high relative to your income. And I can tell you that if the amount of your debt is more than twice your income, then you're not likely going to be able to afford any plan but IBR. It just happens to sort of work out that way. Because in that case, IBR would give you the lowest monthly payment in general. If you're planning a career in public service and you're hoping to take advantage of public service loan forgiveness, then you need to pick a plan, a payment plan that is a qualifying payment plan. And there are only 3 payment plans that qualify: income-based repayment, income contingent repayment, or the standard payment plan. But if you chose the standard payment plan and have the debt paid off in 10 years, there's no debt left to forgive. And chances are, if you're doing public service, you couldn't afford to pay that amount, at least based upon your own income. And income-based repayment usually results in a lower monthly payment than income contingent repayment. And since you want to try to maximize the amount of forgiveness that you would get, that would be to your advantage. And also, I've already mentioned this notion of subsidy in IBR. That doesn't exist in income contingent repayment. There is no interest subsidy in income contingent repayment. So that's why I think IBR is a better option than income contingent repayment. So what loans are eligible? Well, they're basically the federal loans you've been borrowing here at the law school. Federal Stafford loans, federal direct student loans, both subsidized and unsubsidized, federal Grad Plus loans, and if you have a prior consolidation loan, the consolidation loan is eligible provided it did not include the payoff of a Parent Plus loan. And none of you look old enough to have borrowed a Parent Plus loan, because a Parent Plus loan is the loan you would have borrowed as the parent of an undergraduate student to help pay for your undergraduate student's education. If your parents borrowed a Plus loan to help pay for your education, those are not your loans. They are your parents' loans. You may have agreed to pay back part of that loan, but you could not have consolidated their Parent Plus loan as part of your debt. So the only way you could have a Parent Plus loan is if you have, at one point in time, had an undergraduate student that you were paying the education for. And as I said, none of you look old enough for that. So in essence, all of the federal loans you borrowed here at the law school are eligible, and chances are the federal loans you borrowed as an undergraduate, other than Perkins, are eligible, because you'll notice Perkins was not in that list. But if you consolidate the Perkins, which you can, then it becomes eligible debt to be repaid using IBR, because now it's part of a consolidation loan. How do you qualify? Well, to enter income-based repayment, you have to have what's called partial financial hardship. And here is a technical definition for partial financial hardship. If you want to read this at some point in time, feel free. I'm not going to waste your time now, because it's a technical definition that even many financial aid professionals and loan servicers have trouble understanding on the first read-through. In general, what it says is that you have a partial financial hardship if the amount you'd be required to pay under the standard 10-year payment plan at the time you entered repayment, if that amount is greater than you'd be required to pay based upon the IBR formula, then you're experiencing a partial financial hardship. In general, that's going to be true if the total amount of your debt exceeds your household adjusted gross income. And that's what this slide says. In general, it exists when the total eligible debt at the start of repayment exceeds your household adjusted gross income. So, how might it apply? Well, here's some actual numbers. And here, I'm having to specify the type of loan only because I had to assume an interest rate. So I'm assuming this is all Stafford debt, but it's only going to even be more true with a combination of Stafford and Grad Plus loans. But at this $150,000 figure, if your income was greater than $154,000, you wouldn't have a partial financial hardship. But if it's equal to this or less, you have a partial financial hardship, at least in the year 2011. If your household size includes a spouse, then it's even a bigger amount because more of your income is protected. If you also have a child, or if you have two dependents in addition to yourself, then that income level threshold is even higher. So here's why I feel I can say that if the amount of your debt is greater than your household income, then you have a partial financial hardship. Does that make sense? I'm just trying to give you kind of a rule of thumb. So how is the monthly payment calculated if you have a partial financial hardship? Well, it's based upon your household adjusted gross income, or AGI, your household size, and the federal poverty guideline established by HHS, or the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. So let's define these terms. What is household AGI? Well, it's your adjusted gross income. And if you've ever filled out a federal tax return, you know that it's the bottom number on the front page of whichever 1040 form you filled out. It's basically your before tax income. It's your gross earnings, minus a few possible deductions. If you're married, and this is according to the federal definition of marriage, then it includes your spouse's adjusted gross income, but only if you file a joint federal tax return. Because then a joint federal tax return includes both your income and that of your spouse. But if you file separately, then it only includes your income. And it never will include the income of anyone else residing in your household, regardless of their relationship to you. So if you have a partner, or if you're married, if you're gay and you have a partner, then you've married, but that doesn't meet the federal definition of marriage. Again, you can't technically file jointly, so that wouldn't include his or her income. And it's not going to include the income of your parents if they're residing with you, or any other dependents. Now, note, if you are married and you file jointly, then it's not only going to be your spouse's income that's going to be factored in, but it will also factor in your spouse's eligible federal debt. And it doesn't have to be the case that your spouse is also opting for IGR as a payment plan, but it's at least going to take into account his or her debt as well. And it's going to look at what proportion of the household's debt is your debt, and then when they calculate the monthly payment based upon the household's income, they're going to apply that same percentage. So if you have 50% of the debt, then 50% of the household's monthly payment is going to be what you're required to pay towards your debt. The other 50% is available for your spouse, regardless of what payment plan they happen to have chosen. What is household size? Well, in this case, it doesn't depend upon how you file your taxes. It's always going to be you. It's always going to include your spouse, if married, according to the federal definition. It's going to include any dependent children residing in the household, including an unborn child, provided that unborn child will be born within the next 12 months. Now I pause. It actually says 12 months, even though the normal gestation period for human beings is over 9 months. But the point is, you can't count a child that you're thinking about having. It has to be the case that the child has been conceived, even if it hasn't been born yet. You also, though, can include any other dependents residing in your household for whom you provide at least 50% of their support. And increasingly now, it may be the case that one of your parents is living with you. And it doesn't have to be that you're giving them 50% of their support in cash, but maybe you're providing shelter for them. And so that you could count them as a dependent. So that's what's going into this household size. And why is that count, or why does it matter? It's because when it comes to calculating your monthly payment, it basically works like this. We look at your household adjusted gross income, and we know that a portion of that income has to be used to cover your basic subsistence needs, shelter, food, and clothing. And so we're going to protect a part of your income. And the amount we're going to protect is equal to 150% of the federal poverty guideline for your household size in the state in which you reside. So as I said earlier, for a household of one residing in the 48 states in the year 2011, that's $16,335, or about $1,300 a month. Not all that much money is being protected of your gross earnings. Of the amount of income left, the other portion of your income, that's considered disposable. And of that, the government expects you can afford to pay 15% of that annually towards your federal student loans. And so your monthly payment then would be 1/12 of that 15%. And in numbers, it looks like this. Let's suppose your household adjusted gross income was $80,000, which happens to have been the median for the class of 2011. Then the monthly payment would be $796. Well, that's quite a bit less than what we were looking at when we looked at the chart with the payment plans, where we compared the standard and the extended. Here, under the standard for $150,000 of debt, it would have been somewhere in between here, and under the extended plan, it would have been somewhere here. But in both cases, we're talking about more than that $796 a month. So in that case, the IBR plan would provide the lowest monthly payment. Does that make sense? All right, now let's quickly go back forward. Now again, that's why I gave you this chart, because this gives you a more comprehensive explanation of what would the monthly payments be based upon income. And because the calculations are in part dependent upon the federal poverty guideline, which is usually adjusted once each year in January, this chart only applies to 2011. If the poverty guidelines change in 2012, which we expect that they will, then the numbers in this chart would change. The poverty guideline is going to go up. If the poverty guideline would have to fall, then they don't change it. So if the poverty guideline goes up, then what does that do in terms of your discretionary income at any given level of income? It decreases it because we're protecting more of your income. So at any level of income, as the poverty line goes up, these numbers will go down. So the monthly payment in the future would be less for any given level of income and household size. And once your payment is calculated, it's set then for 12 months. Now, what would happen if your income were to change during those 12 months? Are you required to notify the servicer? No. You are not required to notify them if your income changes. Well, if your income goes up, then you're probably not inclined to want to notify them because they would have to increase your monthly payments. But what if your income were to fall? Well, you're not required to notify them, but you can. They are not required to adjust or change your monthly payment, but they likely would then just grant you some degree of forbearance, which wouldn't necessarily postpone repayment, but forbearance also is a means by which they can reduce or modify your monthly payment until they're required to recalculate your monthly payment at the end of each 12-month period. All right? Any questions about that?
If during that period your income goes up and you wish to make lump sum payments to bring your overall balance down, is that possible or is it advisable at all?
The question is, if you, during that period of time, had your income go up, could you pay extra if you wanted to? And I'm going to generalize the question. At any point, could you pay extra if you wanted to? And the answer is yes. You have the right to make prepayments without penalty, which means you'll save the extra interest that would have accrued had you not paid that money early. You won't jeopardize the payment plan you're on. You won't jeopardize your eligibility for deferment or forbearance, or if you're in grace. Now, the second part of your question was, is it advisable to do that? And I can't give you advice because I'm not a certified financial planner. But what I can do is tell you what I think you need to think about. And that is, what other use would you have for that money if you didn't make that payment, that extra payment? And is that alternative use of more value to you than prepaying on your student loan? And only you can really evaluate that. But furthermore, if you're doing a job, if your career path is public service, you plan to be in a public service position, either with a 501c3 or government agency throughout your career, such that you likely will qualify for the forgiveness after 10 years, then you probably don't want to pay back any more than you have to, because you're just reducing the amount of tax-free forgiveness you're going to get at the end of that 120-month period of time. Okay? Another question or comment over here?
Well, I was just thinking in my head, and then I wasn't sure if I was right. If you were to make that large sum payment, wouldn't the next year potentially your debt be lower than your income, and then you don't qualify for the IBR anymore?
The question is, if you make a lump sum payment such that it reduces your debt, would you then not qualify perhaps, or not have a partial financial hardship the next year, because now your debt is much lower, and it doesn't look at your debt at the current point in time. It's, in terms of doing the partial financial hardship determination, it's always referring back to what was your debt at the time your loans entered repayment or at the time you entered IBR, whichever was greater. So it's not going to look at your debt at that current point in time, it's going to go back to that reference point. So no, it won't affect your eligibility for the partial financial hardship. And if you do reach a point where you no longer have a partial financial hardship, it doesn't mean you can't still use IBR as your payment plan. But at that point, the amount of your monthly payment is now not based upon your income. It's going to be equal to what would have been required if you had chosen the standard 10-year payment plan at the time you entered IBR. So that represents an upper bound on how much you would have to pay. Because remember, the determination of whether or not you have a partial financial hardship or not is the amount you'd be required to pay based upon your income less than or greater than what would have been required to pay under the standard 10-year plan at the time your loans entered repayment. And you're never going to have to pay more than that per month. At least be required to pay. You always could opt to pay more, but you're never going to be required to pay more than that, even if you're an IBR. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, that was a good answer.
I know you mentioned that gay couples who are married state but not federally can't count their spouse as part of the household as a spouse. Can they count their state spouse as part of that household as a dependent?
Okay. And the only reason I brought this up is because I know California has a different position on this issue than the federal government. And since you're in California, I just want to make sure that you understand. In terms of a spouse, a gay spouse, because the federal government does not recognize that relationship as being a marriage, then it doesn't count. You can't file jointly in terms of the federal taxes. And as a spouse, you can't count them as part of your household. However, if you're providing at least 50% of that person's support financially, you can count them because of that, but not because they're your spouse. Any other questions? All right, let's keep going because we have a bit more we want to talk about. If you decide to exit IBR, which you could choose to do, you don't have to. Once you're in IBR, even if at some point you no longer have a partial financial hardship, it's not that you're kicked out. It's just that at that point, your monthly payment is not going to be based upon your income. It's going to be that standard one. But let's suppose you decided you wanted to switch to another payment plan. In most cases, what you would want to be switching to would be the extended plan, because it would result in a lower monthly payment. Because as your income rises, then your monthly payment increases in IBR. And if your income is just below that threshold, where the monthly payment is almost the same in IBR as it would be under the standard plan, then you might end up having a lower monthly payment if you could switch to the extended plan. And if that was important to you, that is something you can do. But at that point, you first have to do an intermediate step. You first have to go to the standard repayment plan. And then they look at how much is your debt at that point. And they recalculate what would you have to pay to get that amount of debt paid off in the number of months remaining in that original 10 years, minus the number of months you've already been in repayment. So it's likely going to be an amount that was higher or could be higher